Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to our latest stories. Before I start, tell me where you are watching me from. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that will follow me for years. He really confused me when he knocked on my door at night with red wine in his hand. At first, I thought maybe he had the wrong house, or maybe I had misread the way he'd been looking at me lately. But when I opened the door and saw him standing there, his shoulders tense but his smile soft, something in me knew this wasn't a mistake. The hallway light cast a warm glow on his face, catching the strands of silver in his hair. I couldn't help but notice how unusual the whole scene felt. It was past 9, and I had already slipped into a loose sweater, ready to read before bed. The last thing I expected was a knock, much less from him. We'd been neighbors for years, exchanging polite greetings over the fence, casual nods when taking out the trash, the occasional small talk about weather or yard work. There was always a certain calmness in his presence, like he carried his years with a kind of dignity I respected. But we had never crossed the line into friendship, not really. That night, though, he stepped across it, literally, when I finally moved aside and let him in. The red wine bottle looked almost like an excuse, something to hold so his hands weren't empty, but also something that carried meaning. I caught the faintest tremor when he offered it to me, like this wasn't something he did often. I took it with a smile, unsure if I was smiling because of the wine or because of him. My living room was softly lit by a single lamp, the kind of warm yellow light that made shadows dance along the bookshelves. He glanced around, taking it in, not as a stranger, but as someone suddenly curious about the hidden corners of my world. I asked him to sit, and I fetched 2 glasses. As I poured, I wondered what he wanted to say, and why he chose this moment. We started with small talk. It always starts there. He complimented the framed photograph on the wall, a picture of the ocean I had taken years ago. He told me it reminded him of a trip he once took along the Pacific Coast Highway, how the endless waves had made him feel both tiny and infinite at the same time. There was something in his voice then, something layered, as if he wasn't just talking about the ocean. I listened closely, maybe more closely than I had to anyone in a long time. His words had weight, not because of how they sounded, but because of the silence that followed each one. That silence wasn't awkward, it was comfortable, even meaningful, as if both of us were letting the moment breathe. The wine was smooth, dark, and rich, but it wasn't the wine that warmed me. It was the way he kept leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees, as though what he had to say mattered deeply and he needed me to know it. I felt a flicker of nervousness, though not the kind that makes you want to run. More like the kind that makes you lean in, curious, cautious, but drawn in just the same. He told me he'd been thinking about time. About how it passes, often unnoticed, until suddenly it feels heavier on your shoulders. He said he didn't want to waste it anymore, that too many nights had been spent in silence, watching television or listening to the quiet walls of his house. He wanted to feel connected, truly connected, before more years slipped by. I didn't know how to respond at first. His honesty caught me off guard, almost as much as his arrival at my door had. But then I realized I felt the same. My evenings had become predictable: tea, a book, sometimes a call with family that felt more like a routine than a true conversation. Life had become steady, but also strangely hollow in the quiet hours. So I told him. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Enough for him to know he wasn't the only one who carried that weight. I admitted that I, too, had been thinking about time, about how it seems to slip through your fingers like sand. I confessed that sometimes the loneliness hit harder than I let on. Something changed in the room after that. The lamp's glow felt softer, the air warmer, as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. We weren't just neighbors anymore. We were 2 people admitting, in our own quiet ways, that we didn't want to be invisible to each other. The conversation stretched long past what I expected. The wine bottle slowly emptied, but neither of us noticed how much we had poured. The clock ticked, but I barely heard it. He shared stories of his youth, of choices he wished he had made differently, of moments that shaped him. I shared mine too, the triumphs and the regrets, the laughter and the heartbreak. By the time the night had deepened into something almost sacred, I realized that his knock on my door hadn't just confused me, it had woken something in me. Something that had been quiet for too long. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated, like he wasn't sure if he should. I walked him to the door, and for a moment, we just stood there, looking at each other. No words needed to be said. Respect, understanding, and something fragile yet strong hung between us. After he left, I stood in the quiet house, holding the empty glasses. I thought about how unexpected the night had been, how easily it could have never happened if he hadn't found the courage to knock, and if I hadn't opened the door. And I realized, sometimes the smallest choices carry the heaviest meaning. That night didn't end with fireworks or grand declarations. It ended with a quiet promise in my heart, to stop letting time slip unnoticed, to start listening more closely to what it had been trying to tell me all along, and maybe, just maybe, to open my door a little more often. The next morning felt different. I woke up with the lingering echo of last night in my chest, as if the words we had shared were still hanging in the air around me. I made my usual cup of coffee, but the taste felt richer somehow, like even the smallest rituals had shifted. It was strange how just one knock at the door, one bottle of red wine, could stir something inside me I hadn't felt in years. That I sat at my kitchen table, staring out the window at the street. His house sat directly across from mine, quiet as always, blinds drawn, the yard neat and tidy. For years, that house had been just another familiar shape in the neighborhood, no different from the others. But now, it held more weight. I couldn't help but wonder what he was doing at that very moment. Was he drinking his own coffee, replaying the night as I was? Did he regret it? Did he wonder if he had said too much? As I stirred my cup absent-mindedly, I remembered his voice, steady yet tinged with vulnerability, when he spoke about time slipping away. It hadn't been rehearsed, that much I was sure of. It was too raw, too unpolished. And it mirrored thoughts I'd carried quietly for years, but had rarely admitted out loud. By noon, I found myself restless. I tried to busy my hands with small chores, folding laundry, watering plants, tidying up a bookshelf, but my mind kept circling back. What if he thought I hadn't really listened? What if he thought I had just nodded politely and gone back to my usual life, unaffected? I told myself not to overthink it, but that was easier said than done. Finally, I decided to take a walk. The day was mild, the kind where the breeze carries the faintest scent of leaves and soil, reminding you of both change and continuity. As I stepped outside, I noticed him, sitting quietly on his porch with a book in his hands. He looked up almost immediately, as if he had been waiting. His expression softened when our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us moved. I thought about turning back, retreating into the comfort of my solitude. But then I remembered the quiet promise I had made to myself the night before, to open the door a little more often, so I walked toward him. His smile grew as I approached, though he didn't stand right away. There was something grounding about the way he stayed seated, waiting until I was close enough before setting the book aside. The moment felt oddly ceremonial, as though we were both stepping into unfamiliar territory together. I wasn't sure I'd see you today, he admitted, his voice gentle, carrying a mix of hope and uncertainty. I wasn't sure either, I said honestly. But yesterday meant something to me. He nodded, relief flickering across his face. It did to me too. We sat on his porch, the wooden boards creaking softly beneath us. His porch wasn't fancy, just a couple of old chairs, a small table, and pots with half-grown flowers, but it felt welcoming in its simplicity. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting shifting patterns over us, like the day itself wanted to be part of the conversation. We talked again, this time less guarded. He asked me about my favorite places, not the typical ones like restaurants or vacation spots, but the places where I felt most at peace. I told him about a small trail by the river where I used to walk with my children when they were younger, how the sound of the water had always calmed me. He listened, really listened, as if each word carried a story he wanted to know. Then he shared his own, a cabin tucked deep in the woods where he once spent summers with his family. He described the smell of pine, the sound of rain against the roof, the feeling of being away from everything and everyone. His words painted pictures so vivid I could almost see the cabin in my mind. There was a natural rhythm to our exchange, like two melodies weaving together without clashing. I realized then that I wasn't simply learning about him, I was rediscovering something in myself, a part that had grown quiet over the years but wasn't gone. As the afternoon slipped into evening, he suggested we take a walk. We moved slowly down the sidewalk, side by side, not in a rush to get anywhere. The neighborhood was calm, with the occasional dog barking in the distance or a car passing by. Yet even in that ordinary setting, everything felt new. At one point, he said something that stayed with me. Do you ever feel like the best parts of life aren't the big moments, but the quiet ones? Like sitting on a porch or walking down a street with someone who understands you? I felt the truth of it so deeply that I didn't need to answer. I simply smiled, and he seemed to understand. When we reached the corner of the street, we paused. The sky was painted in shades of gold and lavender, the kind of sunset that makes you stop and breathe. We stood there, both looking up, both quiet. It wasn't silence of absence, it was silence of presence, a shared acknowledgement of something larger than ourselves. By the time I returned home that night, my restlessness had faded. In its place was a kind of calm anticipation, as though life had tilted just slightly, opening up possibilities I hadn't considered in years. I didn't know where this would lead, or if it was even meant to lead anywhere at all. But for the first time in a long time, I felt alive in the uncertainty. And that was enough. The days that followed moved with a gentler rhythm than I was used to. It wasn't that the world outside had slowed down, traffic still hummed in the distance, news still spilled through the television in the evenings, but inside me, something had shifted. There was a steadiness, a sense of anticipation that carried me from one morning to the next. I found myself listening for small sounds, the creak of his porch chair, the faint scrape of his rake across fallen leaves, even the quiet thud of his door closing. These everyday noises, once unnoticed, had become markers of his presence. And somehow, his presence made my own world feel fuller. We didn't see each other every day. That might have been too much, too fast. But every few days, one of us would find an excuse. He would knock on my door with a borrowed book in hand, or I would wave across the street with a plate of cookies I had baked. Sometimes it was nothing more than sitting on his porch again, sharing the silence as if it were a language only the two of us understood. One evening, about a week after that first knock, he invited me to join him for dinner. Nothing fancy, just a simple meal. He said he liked to cook when he wanted comfort. I hesitated before agreeing, not because I didn't want to, but because I wondered what it would mean. A meal was more intimate than wine, more deliberate than a walk. But then I reminded myself of that quiet promise, to stop letting time slip unnoticed. So I said yes. His home was like him, quiet, thoughtful, filled with pieces of a life lived without trying to impress anyone. Books lined the shelves, some worn from years of use. A wooden clock ticked softly in the background. Photographs sat in simple frames, black and white images of family members whose faces carried echoes of his own. The table was set neatly for two. A small vase of flowers sat in the middle, clearly picked from his own yard. It wasn't grand, but it was intentional. That intention touched me more than any polished gesture ever could. We ate while the evening light poured through the windows, soft and golden. He served a dish of roasted chicken and vegetables, nothing elaborate, but cooked with care. As we ate, the conversation wove itself naturally, slipping between laughter and quiet reflection. He told me stories of his younger years, of friendships he still cherished, of lessons he had learned the hard way. I found myself sharing pieces of my own life I hadn't spoken aloud in years. There was no rush, no sense of performance. Just two people sitting at a table, eating, remembering, discovering. After the plates were cleared, we lingered with our glasses of water, neither of us ready to end the evening. That's when he asked me something unexpected. Do you ever think about the moments you've missed? His tone wasn't heavy, just curious, as if he had been turning the thought over in his mind for some time. I paused, my hands resting around the cool glass. All the time, I admitted. Sometimes I wonder if I've lived more in memory than in the present. I think about the times I could have spoken but stayed quiet, or when I could have reached out but chose not to. The older I get, the more I realize how many chances I let slip. He nodded slowly, his gaze steady on me. I've thought the same. But maybe it's not too late. Maybe the best thing about realizing how much time we've missed is that it makes us want to notice what we still have. The room fell quiet after that, not with sadness but with something softer, acceptance, perhaps. His words stayed with me, settling into the quiet spaces of my heart. Later, when I left his home and stepped into the cool night air, the sky stretched wide and star-dotted above me. I breathed deeply, the kind of breath that feels like it fills more than just your lungs. I thought about how many nights I had stood under this same sky, never really noticing its beauty. And now, suddenly, it felt like the stars themselves were leaning closer, reminding me I was still here, still alive, still capable of new beginnings. The following days, I found myself reflecting not only on him but on myself. I realized how much I had hidden behind routines, how often I had dismissed the small sparks of possibility in favor of comfort. But each conversation with him was a reminder that it was possible to change that, no matter how many years had already passed. It wasn't a romance, not in the way books or movies like to tell it. It was something steadier, quieter, and perhaps deeper. It was respect, and a willingness to see and be seen. It was the courage to share pieces of ourselves without knowing what would come next, and though I didn't know what tomorrow might bring, I knew this. The door had opened, and I didn't want to close it again. The weeks turned into months, and what had started with a single knock on my door became a rhythm of its own. Not every day, not even every week, but often enough that the thread between us never loosened. Life continued in all its ordinary ways: grocery trips, yard work, quiet evenings, but the difference was that now, the ordinariness wasn't lonely. He and I fell into a gentle pattern. Sometimes it was coffee on my porch in the early mornings, the steam curling up between us as we watched the neighborhood slowly wake. Other times, it was a slow walk at dusk, letting the cool air guide our steps while the day surrendered to night. And sometimes, it was just the comfort of sitting in silence, knowing there was someone beside us who didn't need filling words to understand. One evening, he brought out an old photo album. The cover was worn, the pages yellowing at the edges. He set it between us like a shared offering. I hesitated at first, not wanting to intrude on memories that weren't mine, but he encouraged me. "These are pieces of me," he said quietly. "I don't want them to sit in boxes anymore." We turned the pages slowly. Faces I'd never known smiled up at me: parents, siblings, children, friends, each one carrying a story he carefully unraveled as I listened. His voice shifted with each picture, sometimes bright with laughter, sometimes heavy with memory. What struck me most was not the details of his stories, but the trust in sharing them with me. And then, without planning to, I fetched my own photo albums. They had been tucked away for years, gathering dust in the back of a closet. For the first time in so long, I opened them with another person by my side. I pointed out the younger version of myself, my children as babies, the house I once called home. There were smiles, but also pauses, the kind that come when a picture stirs something deeper. He didn't rush me through them. He just let me move at my own pace. In that moment, surrounded by pieces of two different lives spread across the table, I felt something profound, that the past doesn't have to be carried alone. Not long after, we planned a small trip together. Nothing far, nothing elaborate. Just a drive to the coast, to see the ocean he had spoken of on that very first night. I almost said no at first. Travel felt like something I wasn't used to anymore, something that belonged to younger years. But he looked at me and said, "It's not about the trip. It's about noticing the world again. Together." So I agreed. The drive itself was unhurried. We stopped for coffee along the way, laughed at a wrong turn that took us through a town neither of us had heard of, and let the radio play songs from years long past. I watched the landscape roll by: fields, hills, stretches of open sky, and felt a freedom I hadn't felt in years. When we finally reached the coast, the sound of the waves filled the air. He was right, the ocean stretched endlessly, both humbling and comforting. We stood side by side, the wind pulling at our hair, the horizon reminding us of how small and yet how significant a single life can be. Neither of us spoke for a while. We didn't need to. The moment itself was enough. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with colors too beautiful to name, I realized something. This wasn't just about him, or about me. It was about what happens when two people decide to show up for each other, even when it would have been easier to stay behind closed doors. That night, as we drove back, I leaned against the seat and closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to hold on to the quiet joy that filled me. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was real. When I think back now, I see that everything began with something so small: a knock on the door, a bottle of red wine, and the courage to say yes. From that moment forward, life didn't suddenly become perfect or free of challenges. But it became more alive, more present. And maybe that's the real lesson: connection doesn't always arrive when we expect it. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of a neighbor, a glass of wine, or a walk at dusk. It asks only that we open the door, both to another person and to ourselves. As I sit here telling you this memory, I realize that growth doesn't end with age. It continues, as long as we're willing to listen, to share, and to let ourselves be surprised. And I will never forget that night he knocked, because from then on, I learned not only about him, but about myself and about the beauty of letting someone in.